All right, welcome everybody. I'm Stacey Malcolm, Condominium Manager and Resource and Compliance Officer with Condominium Management Group, and pleased to be your moderator for this session. Joining us today, we have two experts, the first of which is Cameron Carter, founder and president of Normac Appraisals Limited. Cameron is an accredited member of the Real Estate Institute of British Columbia and the Real Estate Institute of Canada. Next, we have Justin Tudor, president of Keller Engineering. Justin has overseen and completed hundreds of reserve fund studies, building condition assessments, and technical audits, among many other items. Welcome, gentlemen. More than ever, it is important to complete appraisals to ensure sufficient replacement value coverage. Cameron, how often do you recommend a corporation obtain an insurance appraisal?
First of all, thank you, Stacey, for inviting me to this, and to everyone who's watching and listening. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experience with you. To answer your question, according to the Condominium Act, each property or condominium must be insured to full replacement cost annually. So that's the short answer. Expanding upon that a little bit, full replacement cost refers to the cost to rebuild the property today. And it also must include demolition and removal and a building code and bylaw review. So in essence, the appraisal is designed to cover all the costs that a property would need to incur and pay if something disastrous were to happen to the property. Now, the only way to do this realistically is to obtain an insurance appraisal each year. So what we do to sort of make that a little easier cost-wise for the owners is to have a 3-year program. So they have the full appraisal in year 1, and then they get 2 free updates in years 2 and 3 of the program. But the short answer is every year really is how often it should happen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Now, we received a question from one of our directors with their registration. Thank you to those directors that are here in attendance, of course, and those that submitted questions. The question that we received was, how do you determine how much insurance to carry for buildings?
Well, you have to take a look at cost guides and your own internal database to get an idea of, for each particular type of building with a quality type, you would have a cost for that building. So our cost guides internally are quite large. We've done tens of thousands of appraisals over the years. And whenever we do a new property, we get the replacement cost of the building when it was built. So that's excellent information. We rely upon that. And again, going back to my previous answer, you have to look at everything: the cost of the buildings, the site improvements, the building code and bylaws, as well as a consideration for the demolition and removal costs. So I hope that answers the question.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. So with the majority, if not all, of our corporations, they pay annually for their insurance right at the renewal date. When is the best time in relation to that renewal date for them to undertake an appraisal? And what obligations does a corporation have to provide this information to their insurance broker to update their coverage?
The way the market is now, it's a challenging market for insurance, no doubt. So what we would recommend is 60 to 90 days before the renewal date of the policy, you should get your appraisal to the broker. That'll give them as much time as possible in order to go out and find underwriters to make sure that the best deal is obtained for their clients, which is the condominium owners. And so that is, I guess, as far as the condominium boards go, that's their responsibility to make sure that happens. They have to make sure that the appraisal, the replacement cost valuation gets out to that broker in time, so that proper insurance can be placed in time for the renewal date. So that would be my answer to that question.
Is there an alternative way, perhaps like a mid-year that they could do if let's say the appraisal just is happens to be undertaken midway through their insured year?
Absolutely, it happens all the time. So if the renewal date is, January 1st, but the appraisal date is actually June 1st, then when that appraisal comes up in June, the broker would then undertake to make an adjustment to the valuation that was previously there. So that's, it adds a little bit of extra paperwork, to be honest, when you do that sort of thing. So what a lot of our clients do in time, once they realize the value of it, is they get us to match the insurance appraisal date or the effective date of the appraisal with the renewal date of the policy. So that way the condominiums only have to do the paperwork once, as well as the brokers. So it essentially makes it a lot easier on everybody if you do that. And so we do that all the time. We adjust the timing of our appraisals to match the insurance renewal date.
Interesting. Okay. Very cool. All right. Well, let's talk the difference between replacement value and property or market value.
Right. Well, these two get mixed up all the time, and for good reason. It's a little bit confusing, and I'll try to explain it a little bit as clearly as possible. But replacement cost is the cost to replace the buildings and the site improvements new or today, but it doesn't take into consideration land value at all. On the other hand, market value of a property refers to the price that a reasonable purchaser would pay for that property, and it does actually include the value of the land, as well as the depreciated cost of the structures and site improvements and so forth. So they're not the same really at all, to be honest. And it's often that they get confused, but it's normal, and we have no problem explaining the difference to our clients.
You know,
Okay.
from our perspective, it's one of those things too, that we always hear people ask about property values and ask about real estate, and just trying to make that related to the product that's out there. For like, you always hear insurance appraisals, well, what's the value of the property? And as Cam says, it's a different animal. It's replacement value, not market value. We'll get the same on reserve fund. It'd be, wow, this must be a great condominium to buy. It has $3 million in the reserve fund. But the reserve fund study in the process might mean they actually need $5 million next year. So it's the comfortability with a lot of people equating things that they know a little bit about to condominium or either reserve fund or insurance appraisal that can often lead people to make improper assumptions about the documents that they're getting. So it's these little quirks, and I often see it, like Cam suggests, when real estate and market value tries to sneak in on domains that aren't quite theirs.
Okay, interesting. I know
Sorry,
that's something that
number one, more to come.
Yeah. So Cameron, what trends are we seeing with the replacement value of our properties and the implications of current appraisals, or on the current appraisals that you're seeing, and then subsequently on the insurance premiums for these corporations?
Right. Yeah, it's been a bit of a tough go, as far as construction goes, in terms of the costs. To be perfectly blunt, construction costs have gone up a lot over the past couple of years. It's mainly due to three reasons. First is a booming real estate market. So there's all this demand for new homes and so forth. So that puts pressure on labor and materials. And it's fueled by low interest rates, of course. But the material cost is the second reason. So we've seen double and even triple digit increases over some of the core materials that go into a building over the past couple of years. Anything such as lumber, iron ore, copper, and aluminum, they've gone up a lot over the past 2 or 3 years. And then the last major factor is labor shortages. So Ontario already had that built in before COVID and so forth. There was already a shortage of construction labor in Ontario to a significant extent. But COVID has increased that factor, definitely, due partly to CERB keeping some workers on the sidelines. And secondly, COVID has basically kept immigrants from coming to the country, right? We've all kind of shut our borders off. And what that's done is it's kept new immigrants into Canada away from the construction workforce, which to the best of my knowledge is made up about 25% of new immigrants is the construction workforce. So all those three things together have meant that appraisals or construction costs have gone up quite a bit over the past couple of years. And as an extension, insurance premiums will be higher. The brokers and underwriters will do their best to mitigate that. But I guess it does, in my mind, highlight the importance now more than ever of making sure you've got a current appraisal, because things are changing rapidly right now. and the risk as a result of that is much higher. So yeah, the short answer is it's gone up quite a bit over the past couple of years. Where it ends up, it'll come back down to normal levels in time once supply chain and so forth comes around. But and I'm sure Justin can speak to that because he deals directly with materials and so forth in his job.
Cam, just a question for you though.
Yeah.
Do you ever see when these transitory inflations come down, do they ever actually affect the replacement value in a negative way? Is that a real thing, or is that just something everybody hopes one day?
Like an actual negative,
Yeah,
downturn?
give me a negative replacement value without decreasing the market value of my property. Is that a thing that happens?
It does. It's rare, but it does happen. You know, it's possible. It depends how this whole thing with the economy shakes out. But who knows? Maybe after this is all said and done, we may have a contraction in construction costs. It happens. It's rare. The last large one was back in the 2008, 2009 downturn. So that was a kind of a crazy period because it was huge increases going up in construction costs. Then the market crashes. And then there was a decrease, almost like you went from a 10% increase in 1 year to a 10% decrease in construction costs in the next year. So it does happen, it's rare, but it does also highlight the fact that it's a pretty good idea to make sure your valuation is current.
I heard somebody say, I'm really looking forward to precedented times. And that's what I'd really like here too, like just some degree of certainty and familiarity, because you're exactly right. These types of contractions, they don't happen, but if they happen next year, we'd all be like, sure, I got that. I expect that. That's what 2022 should look like.
So Justin, further to the material costs, labor shortages, and the other implications that Cam was speaking to previously, how are project consultants at Keller seeing this impact project costs?
Yeah, we're seeing it kind of all over the place. There are some things that are reliable in Ottawa, and that's the price to pay a 19-year-old to chip concrete over top of his head in the garage. Like that's always going to cost whatever it costs to do this. Material prices, we're seeing the baseline inflation and then project specific inflation, and it's important to kind of understand where some of these different items are coming from. And as Cam alluded to, some are very specific. Like you think about wood, a home building boom. Everybody 2 years ago was building a deck. Every restaurant needed to build tables and porches outside. Like, of course, there was going to be less wood. Now these decks at restaurants are being repurposed and they're already built. You don't need 2 decks in your backyard. And I'm not sure if the home booming is going to slow down, but to some degree we've seen it. Like last summer was crazy for wood. This fall is not. So depending on your projects, if they're material focused, you might be able to ride some of those out. Some projects that we see very commodity based, like with aluminum or asphalt, these are going to fluctuate, but they were going to fluctuate last year. They were going to fluctuate 10 years ago. So it's about having a plan and shooting your shot there. But what we see is the impact of Ottawa too. It's not, as Cam was saying, like Ontario's had a labor shortage for a long time. And in Ottawa, you can really see where it is. And you can see where it's going. We have the LRT that has taken every laborer for the last 4 years and for the next 10. Parliament Hill, if you have a small corporation and you're trying to figure out why you can't get qualified masons to work on your project, is because masons for years have just been going job site to job site every 2 days. Now, with a relatively little bit of skill on stonemason, you can go up to Parliament and work there like an office job for 5 years. So masons in Ottawa specifically are hard pressed to find small projects because there is a really good and appealing 10-year project for them. And we're only 1 million people here. So there's only so many masons. There's only so many people that both want to chip concrete like this and just walk a rail line. So those are really affecting the labor shortage. And we see that in big projects. So if you have a parquet roof that you have to do, you're going to be paying largely union rates across decreasing the amount of contractors that want to do the work. And if you have a small project, if you're really looking for the qualified and experienced trades, you're going to be waiting for the one contractor who has 3 key installers to be available to come do it. And that's just the world we're kind of living in right now. So those labor resistances, coupled with a like right now, for example, if you want to get a small project done right now, you're nowhere. Like if you can't wait till next year, these people are all booked in. They know what they're going to do until January. And if you need to do it, you're going to pay a premium for it, which isn't worth it when you're considering condominiums usually base these projects on reserve fund values, which don't take into account labor premiums or timing premiums. So we're seeing it. It's real. To the extent that it's predictable, I don't know. We get told as reserve fund planners to pick interest rates and inflation rates for the next 25 or 30 or 45 years, depending on what province you're in. And if I could tell you what the interest and inflation rate looked like 20 years from now, I would not be doing this. I'd be doing that, because it's a guess. Like we don't know when the next thing is going to change everything up. So we're doing what we can. We're taking the information that we can. We're adjusting the models as reasonably predictable as we can.
Okay, we do have a question in the Q&A. Our reserve fund study already includes a 2.5% inflation rate. For the coming year, inflation will be 4.5%. Do we need to add only 2%, or should we add more to take into account the increase in other costs such as labor and steel, etc.? And if so, how much without impacting too much on the monthly condo fees? So in terms, I guess, of inflation and interest rates per our reserve fund studies, if you could maybe speak to that a little bit and how it's impacted.
I love this question. Like it's really good, because it's going to let me talk for 7 minutes uninterrupted about something I love. No, there's a lot here to unpack, so I want to get into it. Your reserve fund is going to pick an inflation rate, typically forecasting out over the next 30 years. But the value that it puts in at the time of the study should be based on market conditions right now. So what's the cost to do it right now? Oh, you got rid of the question, so I'm going to lose the other half. There it is. No, it's fine. I found it. So if your reserve fund's done this year, it should take into account everything and make a reasonable projection in the future. I'm going to pin that for a minute. If your reserve fund was done last year and it said a 2.5% inflation rate, then that was what they expected the construction costs that were going to be in this year. We're going to be 2.5% higher. They're actually, let's say, on average, 4.5% higher. You can get that 4.5% from a lot of areas. You can get that from the StatsCan Consumer Price Index. You can get that from quotes that you're seeing from contractors that change year to year. So to the extent that you might have to pay more, that's very real. But do you need to adjust your plan, or do you need to adjust your funding contributions as a result of that? I would say be careful with that approach. It's not, what we're telling people most importantly is it's not to freak out right now. Look at your plan and look at your requirements of your plan. If you don't have any work if you're a newer condo, you don't have any work scheduled until 15, 16, 17 years from now, then adjusting the inflation, your contributions as a result of inflation right now is maybe it's a drop in the bucket. Maybe we have a contraction 2 years, then you have to have a conversation about decreasing your fees for the same reason. And I don't think that's necessarily appropriate. The reserve fund in Ontario is a living document. You're going to look at the finances every 3 years. So when you do have a break, you don't need to freak out about it. You need to say, we need to adjust the cost based off today, and in 3 years from now, we'll be able to relook at it again. Now, if you have real projects that are coming in and that's adjusting your, and their inflationary increases are adjusting your bottom line, your funding plan, you can look to project deferring or grouping projects or other means for money. But just adjusting how much you're contributing based off this year's inflation, I think is premature unless you're looking at a reserve fund while you're doing it. I think otherwise you're just guessing like everyone else. There's one more thing that I want to bring up as it relates to this to wrap out my 7-minute answer is we have to pick inflation for 30 years. We have to pick interest rates for 30 years. And if I put in for 30 years, your interest rate that a standard condominium can get on their assets, I'm going to put in 1%. It's not real, but on average, whatever. And if I put in real inflation rate over 30 years, what, 2%. So that's going to put a decreasing value on any cash you have in the bank in the model. Now we know that's not going to happen, but if I tell you that in your bank account on paper, you're losing 1% a year, you're going to be inclined to spend that. And that's not what we want to encourage in reserve fund planning. We do want you to repair things before they become so damaged that they are deteriorating the underlying structure. Replace a roof above the penthouse before it leaks, absolutely. But don't replace a roof 2 years early because the value of your money might not be the same in 2 years. That's a bad way of doing it. But unfortunately, if we plug in 100% real predictable interest rates for this moment over 30 years, that's what the model will tell. So I like being really careful there. I like being nuanced. If anybody wants to really geek out about this later, I'd love to talk about it. But there's a lot of considerations when you're looking at inflation over the long term. And over the short term, don't freak out. Have a plan. Don't fall in love with it.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that question and allowing Justin to speak for, it was only about 5 minutes, actually. You kept it into 5 minutes. So I do kind of want to circle back. So you've referenced delays in work and you know, other that kind of consideration for these supply chain issues and costs and existing high inflation. What consideration should be given when delaying projects is on the table?
Yeah. So is it obviously life safety? So don't defer something that's structurally unsound and can hurt somebody. That goes without saying. The other one is to take into calculation the additional costs as it relates to deferment. If the project increased by 1/30th in cost by delaying it 1 year and its lifespan is supposed to be 30 years, then that's appropriate to defer. If you defer it a year, it doesn't cost you any more. But let's envision a parkade or a parking garage here, where you have a membrane that's deteriorating, that's causing concrete failure. We've all walked through them. We've been, hey, that's leaking. And then you come back the next year, and it's like, that's leaking and a little bit of concrete's falling. Then the next year, that's leaking and a lot of concrete's falling. That concrete falling is an extra $1,000 a square meter. And if you did it, it's an exponential growth. It goes in a corner. The longer you defer it, the more parking you have to relocate during the project. So as you defer these things, be mindful of the impact of deferring. The other thing we encourage people to do, whether in a pandemic, looking at inflationary increases or supply chain things aside, is don't just reserve fund inspections in Ontario happen usually every 6 years. Often people will not do them every 3 years. So if this is the only chance an engineer has looked at the building, they might go in and say, hey, this roof is 25 years old. It should last 5 more years. So I'm putting it in your budget for 5 years from now. But nobody looks at that roof again until 6 years when the next reserve fund with the site inspection comes in. So the board that's there 5 years from now, and they're looking at the plan, they say, well, it says replace the roof. That board should think and put their planning hat on. Are there any leaks in the roof? Could we do a visual assessment of the roof? The reserve fund plan walks around. It looks at gravel on the roof. It doesn't look at the membrane on the roof. It doesn't pull back some of the insulation. It doesn't take a little cut out of the membrane and bend it around and see if it stinks like rot or if it's still flexible. And that type of information could be provided to the next reserve fund planner and saying, I know more than you can figure out in the reserve fund. So take this information and don't replace this roof now. Replace it 5 years from now. Deferring projects that don't need to be done within a reasonable time frame not only saves money but decreases overall cost because you're keeping the value of that asset rather than shortchanging it. And just when we're just dealing with so much here, so it's important to realize the limits of the reserve fund is a walk around, a visual, and there's a lot more information that can be gained by element assessments. And before you go doing a big project, unless you know that project needs to be done right now, scratch at the surface a little bit, see if it can be deferred, and if it can't, look for capital ways to adjust for it if you need to.
Perfect, thank you. In terms of savings on tendering projects, are there any timing tips tips or tricks you can offer our directors?
For sure. So if you go out to a contractor and just ask them for a quote, on the bottom of every quote, it's going to say this quote is valid for 60 days, this quote is valid for 30 days. Some quotes we saw this summer were saying this quote is valid for 10 days. If I can't order my material in 10 days, it's not going to happen. So that's a real limitation of all the contractors. So when we think about tendering a product, which is a professional way to go out and say, here are all the things that I want, and give me one price on these. You don't get to put in qualifications. You don't get to say 10 days. You don't get to say 90 days. You get to put a number on what I ask you to do. We're getting often with condominium, we put that number at 60 days, just in the idea that it's going to take that cycle and that turnaround for the board to meet, to have a conversation, to come back with questions, to review the prices, to feel really good about it, and then issue a letter of award and sign a contract. We feel like that cycle's 45 days. This year, we've been talking about it can't be. It can't be for 60 days. We can't allow it. The board, everybody has to be lined up to make a decision within 30 days because these contractors are bidding based off, if we tell them 60 days, they're just adding on 10%. They're saying, I can't run the risk of the material going up and me being stuck doing it because I put the bid on. So if we put it at 30 days, they can sharpen their pencils. They feel more confident that they can get the price in and the price is accurate. It just requires the board and the management companies to put their nose to the grindstone and and implement the decisions that they've commissioned.
Okay, perfect. Don't worry, Cam, we haven't forgotten about you. Do you have any comments from the replacement appraisal side in terms of any work that's perhaps deferred or how this could impact the replacement value of items?
Well, for the appraisals, the bigger impact actually is the amount of lead time that you need to give the brokers, to be honest. So when we do our appraisals, we assume everything is brand new as of today, or the effective date of the appraisal. And all those other things that happen, such as deferrals and so forth, over time, they will have small but combined significant impacts on the cost of construction changes, either up or down. So what we do is we report on what is happening and what has happened. So for us, it's more important to have good data about what has happened over the past year or the past 2 years about costs of things. And we're just extending our timeline to give the brokers now more time to actually go out there and find good deals for the clients, really. So that's more important from the appraisal standpoint.
Okay, good to know. Interesting. So back to you, Justin. So we've talked a lot about major projects and big tendering. What kind of considerations should be made just for that operational general maintenance line item and comparable operational costs that come up?
Yeah, I think what we're hearing more and more is this is where you just see people adjusting their rates in anticipation of inflation. So this is everybody's feeling a little bit more at the gas pump. Everybody's seeing it a little bit more at the grocery store. So those people are going back to their companies and the professionals are going, well, what used to be a $65 an hour employee is now going to be a $70 an hour employee. And what used to be a standard maintenance contract at this much, we're going to put on 5 or 10 or 7% more simply to get ahead of it. And that's the downward cycle of inflation, is that you feel it and everybody else thinks they feel it, and then everybody gets to feel it because everybody thought they did. And we're seeing that across the board, and especially in operating conditions. We're seeing a lot of just coming back. Anything that's affected by labor, especially in Ottawa, has to deal with the 2 major projects that are just stealing our city of general labor. And that goes as far as landscaping. If you're trying to find a reliable landscaper who's willing to commit for a multi-year project at a fixed fee, tell me about them. Like, tell everybody about them, because I haven't seen them, and I don't even work property management. I just know that issue that's out there. So from every operational component, we're seeing really. Cam mentioned on the insurance broker time. The lead time issues, and those are real across the board, be it big project or operational side. Even if you want to just do maintenance touch-ups in your garage of membrane right now, even if it's a big maintenance touch-up project where you can command some buying power, you'll get that membrane when they make it. and when they decide to send it on a train to Ottawa, and when that train doesn't get hijacked by more expensive people in Toronto. Like, these things are generally out of control. We talk about micro trips and trucks still, and that trickles down to everybody's supply chain. And so it's just awful and unpredictable. And I really would like to tell you a little bit more about what to expect, but I can't. It's weird right now.
So what Justin's saying is he's not psychic, unfortunately. We should have known that before we invited him to speak to us today, I guess, eh? Thank you very much. So as a follow-up, circling back to reserve fund studies and updates, are we seeing in studies that are being undertaken this year, are we seeing above normal increases in those annual contributions to the reserve fund for those years shortly after the update, so the 3 to 5 year mark?
Yeah, so it all depends on the situation that reserve's in. Now, most the costs all get, whether the work is today or the work is in 30 years, the cost that's calculated within the spreadsheet is based off the cost today. So a newer condominium, or a condominium that's gone through the major life cycle renewals where their costs are deferred 15 or 16 or 17 years, these condominiums are going to have the same increase in cost of the project, but significantly more time to phase it in. And we're seeing that, so that will look like a more modest increase of their annual contributions. But a corporation that was 30 years old and was looking down their 10-year work project of their second roof, their second asphalt, their windows, their parking garage, even a corporation that was well maintained and well funded is now facing major funding obligations that are more than were predicted are going to cost more than were predicted. And that adjustment has to come very quickly, because even if you can take that 10-year worth of work and spread it up to 12 or 15 years, the costs are still going to be too short. And you're going to have to get that money, and that money comes in the way of special assessments, overly higher than predicted annual contribution increases or loans. And we're seeing a lot of people put a three-phase combination together. It's a pain when you look at that as the situation, and you realize that it's just because our building is aging, and if we were 10 years younger, all of this would have been behind us. And that cash flow issue is very real. And where we're really seeing it, and this is the problem forever, but it's exacerbated now, is if you have a small condominium, one of your amenities that doesn't show up in your common elements is the benefit of not a lot of neighbors. And over the years, as you've been facing these funding obligations telling you actually have 2 elevators and only 30 units, you still have a pool, you have a parking garage, you have a roof, and because you are so little units, you felt the impacts of the requirements of the legislation, and that has kept it down and kept it down and pushed it down. And now you have these real costs coming on, and you don't have a lot of people to share these costs with. And we will always see, when the reckoning comes, when everybody realizes we have to spend this, we feel it affect smaller condominiums so much more, because they haven't been as aggressive on funding the reserve fund, and they get to feel the pinch of not having a lot of neighbors when the pinch comes down.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. Cameron, similar question in relation to appraisals for replacement value. Are we seeing over the last year or so a larger, the appraisal value, or rather the replacement value, increasing more than average than we've seen in past years?
Oh, definitely more than average. It's the last 2 years, I would say, have been significantly more than average, due to all the reasons we've talked about: supply chain and labor and materials and so forth. So I wish I had a crystal ball. That would be nice, but I don't. However, I have been in the game long enough to know that over time things will equal out, and we'll get back down to that normal place. But it's as we get to maybe the final comments, it is pretty unprecedented times. I've been at this for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's so much uncertainty, and costs are higher. They'll come back down, but I think everyone should try to protect themselves as best they can right now. It's something I've never seen before, for sure.
That kind of moves us into our last couple items about key takeaways. Did you want to elaborate a little bit further and add to that, Cameron? Any that obviously the unprecedented times, but anything further our guests today should take away from this session?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be an alarmist, but the reality is we're in a perfect storm here, really. So many things are working against construction costs and labor and materials and supply shortages. I mean, there's just boats and trains and everything else that aren't being loaded because there's no one to load the goods, and there's no one to unload them on the other end. So they're all sticking out there in the harbor waiting, right? It's a difficult time. I mean, I'm feeling it too, right? I have to pay my own insurance on the things that I own, and it's gone up a lot. My key takeaway for everybody is, you know what? Protect yourself. Make sure your appraisal is current. Go out and find a company that specializes in appraisals for insurance purposes. Get one done. Know that you're covered properly, and then at least you'll be able to sleep better at night. Times will change. We'll get back down to normal, but that would be my key takeaway. You know, protect yourselves.
Okay, perfect. Justin, before I ask you for your key takeaways, we do have a final question in the Q&A. Do reserve fund fees tend to accelerate over time from new building to 30 to 40 years of age rather than just match inflation?
The cost of the reserve funds themselves, yes and no. It depends on familiarity with the building too, because as much as reserve fund studies, inspections are meant to be visual, some buildings as they age require more visual. Like a new building on a reserve fund, I'm going to have a cursory look through the parking garage. I'm going to make sure there aren't any major defects that show significant signs of deterioration. Little things are going to be addressed by the warrantable issue or in a maintenance program. While a reserve fund study look at a larger parking garage, it'll probably end up saying you should probably do a parking garage condition assessment, but I am going to take a little bit more time identifying, because even if you don't do that, I need to say which level of the parking garage will probably be replaced first. How much concrete do I estimate could be in this repair? So as things age, it does take a little more time. But the same token can be with respect to your engineer. Like if as your engineer becomes more familiar with the building, they might have the quantities already. So there are efficiencies there. What we're seeing is certainly over the last 15 years is the reserve funds are getting more detailed. They're getting more reliant. Like it's not just engineers that can do reserve fund studies. Architects can do them, appraisers can do them, real estate designations can do it. Graduates from a specific program in Ryerson can do it. But as it develops into a more professional document, engineers specifically are putting more time into ensuring that they're putting the professional guidelines, the work that's associated with the professional guidelines. PEO, Professional Engineers of Ontario, just released reserve fund guidelines this year after engineers have been doing them for 20 years. It's a super comprehensive document of providing the most like the class A type of reserve fund study with which I think is a great model, but I don't think anybody wants to pay for that. And we strive to do it as much as we can. And that's why we're seeing cost increase on that side.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And Justin, we'll keep the mic with you if you'd like to add your key takeaways for our directors from this session.
The reserve fund study is a plan. It's not a suicide pact. Don't just do what's in the plan without thinking about it. Think about it. Do we really need to do this? Should we call up our engineer and ask them what they meant by this sentence? Those phone calls are free. Just ask a question before you rip off something because they said it might be bad in 5 years. Please just read your plans and ask questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We would like to thank everyone for joining, especially Justin and Cam for your insightful thoughts and advice today. So just a friendly reminder, this is a 3-part webinar series. So be sure to join us for the rest. Next, I had an extra slide here I forgot about. So those were our key takeaways. Next week, we do have a discussion on the budget process. So with a fellow director, we have Jerry Dupont of CCC number 486 joining us, as well as CMG's very own president, Ian Davidson. And that's it for today, folks. We have a couple minutes to spare on this session. So thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you again to Cam and Justin for joining us. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. My pleasure.